So this morning I went kayaking for the first time in years, many years. And so it was me and my girlfriend in one kayak. And what I noticed was that there were so many cool physics concepts slash takeaways to have from just being in a kayak. And then I realized, well, pretty much everything is like this. Like any activity where you're trying to maybe, other than just like your, walk. Obviously, this applies to every activity, but in certain cases, like certain activities, forces are much more magnified than others, right? Like there's not a lot of like abrupt forces when walking, or hopefully there aren't. But with something like kayaking, what you come to realize is just how important the uh, different kinds of points of contact of the kayak become. And it got me thinking really a lot about exercise. And, I talk pretty much every video about this concept of the anchoring stuff because it's so important. And I thought like a kayak example would be a really good example to draw on to demonstrate this. Now, many of you probably don't have access, nor do I when I'm home, to just like walk somewhere and go kayaking. But hopefully you can get a good idea. Number one, if you ever actually do kayak, you'll know this very clearly. But you can get an idea of what I'm saying, and hopefully in terms of the four stuff that I'm going to describe, cicada, it'll make sense. So when we think about like, okay, I'm going to sit down in this kayak, my goal is to move forward in this instance. Let's just assume for now that I'm not like turning. Okay. What you'll talk to the instructor, and the first thing this woman said to us was like, don't hold the paddle like totally horizontally. So in other words, don't hold it like 90 degrees from your torso so that it makes this like right angle with your torso. When you stick your paddle into the water, you stick it sort of downward and more deeper and more like perpendicular to the sea floor rather than parallel to the sea floor. And I was like, oh, okay. So basically like what we're doing is we're doing like a lat bias thing where we stick the paddle down into the water. And what we do is we pull the water back like we're doing a narrow row. And the reason that we do that is because when we push more directly down and back, we're propelled more forward. And when we push more horizontally out to the side, i.e. the reason that the woman wanted us to avoid the straight like horizontal pull, we create more of a turning force, right? So the difference between sticking the paddle straight down and trying to propel us forward and sticking it more out to the side and trying to propel us forward is there's a lot more rotational forces that are created, an example in terms of the distinction and exercise between these two things would be like, the way that she wanted us to do it to propel us forward would be like a lat biased, like a narrow row. And then the way that she didn't want us to do it, like out to the side, was more of like a reared out fly. Like you can think about it that way. So, obviously I wasn't saying this to her, but I was trying to articulate it to my girlfriend. She was pretending to be interested. But anyway, basically what I was taking from this was like, okay, there's a clear reason that these people are instructing us to do it this way. And I think it's a really, really cool concept to talk about and think about when it comes to just general, everyday activities, and specifically people who work in like manual labor type jobs or just jobs where they're constantly doing a particular skill, because they get really, really good at this skill. And you start to wonder like, well, what makes these people just like incredibly good at what they do? This woman is like flying around in this fucking kayak, going twice as fast as we are if she wants to. And it's because she knows exactly where to push and how to push, and then how to use her body against the implement that she's using, i.e. the kayak and the paddle in this case, to propel herself forward. And she knows the techniques. And she might not be able to explain the perfect physics of like what are the moment arms and what are the planes of motion and what are the component forces of the paddle force that I'm creating and all that stuff, and how do the waves affect forces that I'm dealing with. But it's a really cool idea to be able to actually see like, oh, this is why they do things and they're doing it for this reason, and then to be able to actually articulate and explain why this is the case. So anyway, getting to the skill of the kayaking, it was a really cool thing to figure out because it was like doing an exercise for the first time, or like experimenting with an exercise for the first time that I had never done. That was like totally new to me and totally refreshing, in a sense of like trying to figure something out, much in the same way that I would figure out like a new exercise variant that I'm working on, or, you know, a new way to fit into a machine that I haven't done before, etc. And it was cool to see that application in real life. And so what I came to realize was like, okay, so what happens when I stick my paddle into the water and I'm trying to propel myself forward? Well, the first thing that happens is the water pushes back against me. So let's assume that in this entire example, I'm going to describe as if I'm like, you know, the scenario that I'm going to describe is like as if I stuck my paddle on the left hand into the water and I'm pulling with my left arm to propel me forward. So what happens in this case is you are trying to move yourself forward, but to some degree, because the paddle is to your left side, you're also turning yourself to the right a little bit. So the counter forces via the water that are created against you are essentially these forces that are pushing you in the opposite direction. So when you stick your paddle into the water and you push backward, the water is going to try to pull your entire body forward, much in the same way that like a cable row would pull you forward. And then in addition to that, when I pull to the left, the water is going to try to turn me to the right. So a couple things need to happen insofar as the mechanics of like how you're using the kayak to push yourself forward. And what I discovered very quickly was like, okay, I need to find more anchorage to be able to actually efficiently perform this kayaking activity a little bit better. And because my fiance was sitting in front of me, I was like trying to figure out ways to get her to do it a little bit better too. And so what I came to realize is like, oh, it's exactly the same as like a single arm cable row where you're pulling, you know, again with the left arm here into the water. And so what you need to do is as you initiate that paddle backward, you need to press really hard into the kayak with your same side foot. So in this case, like if I'm rowing with my left arm and again, I'm being turned to the right, I need to push really hard with my left foot into the kayak so that I don't get turned to the right, but also so that I don't get pulled forward. And what you realize is that as soon as the second that you do that, that you apply that anchor and that counter force, immediately all of that force that was then being dispersed through like your trunk and all these things that you didn't want, and maybe your paddle was getting shoved backward a little bit more than you wanted to, just all go directly into propelling you forward, right? So all of, you know, the energy we can say that was sort of leaking out of the exercise prior to us using our feet and our hips in tandem with, you know, the correct paddling technique, not doing it too wide, right? Because doing it too wide, again, would create more of a twisting force as opposed to a force that was propelling us forward. Once we made all those subtle, like anchorage type changes, you know, our boat speed basically like doubled. It's a bunch of dogs barking at me. So I think that's a really cool concept and a cool story to describe really what we're trying to do with exercise and, you know, with external stability and exercise, which is basically like, okay, my goal in this kayak is, you know, in the case I'm describing, is to propel myself forward. So if I want to go forward into the ocean, what I need to do is, yeah, sure, like I could basically try to do it by just using my arms and all that crap. But not only will you get exponentially more tired more quickly doing that, what also happens is you move like a quarter of the speed. So what I need to do is I need to find a way to basically use the implements around me, use the physical constraints around me to my advantage to move me forward more quickly with less energy, right? And what you end up finding in the weight room is exactly that, right? When you use anchors appropriately, i.e. in the case of the kayak, when you use that same side foot to shove against the front of the kayak, when you appropriately angle the paddle down instead of out, what you do is you minimize the things that you don't want to deal with and you maximize the result or the end goal, which is essentially propelling yourself forward. Now, there are tons of other examples in which, you know, changing the way that you're doing that is going to be more appropriate to the goal. But again, when we're training muscles, our goal is to train muscles. It's to basically take one thing or a portion of a bigger thing, right? Like in the instance of doing a lat focused motion, right? All of your lat is involved in any lat motion, but one, you know, region of the lat more than others. For example, whenever you're doing an activity that is more specific to something, which is every activity in the weight room, you need to be specific about the ways in which you're trying to minimize the downsides, if that makes sense. So, you know, to prove this point or to describe this point through experience to my fiance, I was like, okay, on this one paddle, use your same side foot to really shove into the kayak in front of you, like basically with a foot pedal that we had, and do that as you as you row yourself forward. And she was like, oh my God, that feels so much different. And I was like, okay, now just take your feet off and see what happens. And she took her feet off and she was like, yeah, I can barely push into the water when I do that. So, again, I think that's a really cool concept. And, who knows, maybe I'm just talking to myself at this point. But hopefully some of you find that interesting as a kind of cool parallel. And it's cool to think that that applies to literally any sporting activity. Is just like athletes that are really, really good at what they do are also likely really, really good at using the external restraints or constraints or anchors, right, the external stability around them to better accomplish the tasks that they're trying to. So again, the parallel here is if the task in lifting is to fatigue a muscle, then you want to eliminate all of these other forces, all these other downsides that you don't want involved in the exercise. And lo and behold, when you do that, not only again, you get perceivably stronger, but you also accomplish the task with less wasted energy. And as a consequence of that, less wasted energy, less fatigue that you don't want, a better ability to recover, not only a better ability to recover, but as a consequence, a better ability to progress, at least in theory. And I've seen it over and over again, just, in the vacuum of skill acquisition, skill development, skill maintenance, and so on and so forth. So anyway, today we are hitting chest day. It's my last day working out here in Japan. So I will be home soon. I've enjoyed my trip in Japan, but I'm definitely ready to get back to the States. I miss my people and my cats, especially. So I will see you all in the gym for chest. I'm also hitting some triceps and some delts, and it may be interesting to see how I adjust some things in terms of my programming, because this gym doesn't have cables. So, or at least the gym that I'm going to today doesn't have cables. So I'll have to figure some stuff out. It'll be fun to kind of play around. So see y'all there. So we're starting off push day here with a little Smith incline action, which I haven't done in some time. So I figured that I would show the process of setting this up. If you saw the last pull day video that I just posted, the back day, I kind of did this in an inverse way, where I was doing a row, like the low to high row. So I had the bench or the low direction flipped around. But here we're doing press, and I figured I would kind of show my process for setting it up. So first things first is you need to kind of know what you're trying to do with the motion, right? First, right? Because if you don't have a why or a goal, then you don't really have an aim point. So for me in particular, this is going to be like more of a middle to upper pec / delt type of thing. And so I want a little bit of an incline. Right now I set this to probably about like a 30-ish degree incline. I think that's a really good middle ground between enough of an incline to where the low direction is slightly vertical, but not so much that the low direction becomes like that of an overhead press, which would be antithetical to our goals here in training pecs and stuff. So once you set the incline, get back on the bench and pull yourself down and do a row, right? And squeeze your back just however you're comfortable, and just see, okay, number one, where do my hands get to? And number two, do I have wiggle room in rotation there? Because if you don't have any sort of wiggle room, you're going to have a problem actually stabilizing that position. So for me, this feels like a really good position. I have some external rotation available, and I have a good amount of internal, right? So I have that wiggle room to be able to actually stabilize the motion. And then all you're going to do from there is just track your hands up to the bar. And bada bing, bada boom, you got a good thing going. And a great way to sort of break this down would be if you were to, in terms of like the upper pec, middle pec / delt anatomy, where you would stretch those guys. You stretch them in multiple ways, but ultimately your arm just needs to be going backward in some direction and somewhat downward in terms of the loading direction, right? So, we don't want our incline to be like this, because now we're not stretching these guys. We need to have our arm pulled back a little bit. So I'm just going to add some load here, do a couple warm-ups, probably do 3 sets of these today, heavier each set just because I kind of feel like it, and it's a fun thing to do. So we'll jump right in. So I did 2, technically 3 warm-ups, and none of them had anything to do with bullshit rotator cuff drills. Did the empty bar for a little, slapped a 55 on, because I think these are kilos, 25 kilos, like 55 pounds. And then I just added another 15, so I think this is like 185 or something. Not too much, but could care less about the weight here. Probably ascend it a little bit. Go maybe like higher reps first 2 sets, and then a little heavier. Again, for no other reason other than that it's fun. I think that you can get away with doing sets of 6 reps or sets of 15 to 20. Both work, and I think both are probably useful to have in a program at the same or different times. So it's not an either or type of thing. It's probably a both type thing, much in the same way that most things in exercise kind of are. I also noticed that like a lot of people on Smith press in particular, but any fixed grip thing, really any press to be honest, the bar needs to be centered over the wrist. Okay, so if the bar is hanging on the top of the palm, no good. It's going to be bending the wrist back. Keep the bar basically, if you could cut all your fingers off and just imagine where you would have to balance the bar, that's where the bar should be. If your wrist is hurting you during a press, you have a problem. So shove the base of your palm into the bar and not the top of your hand. So another thing to note on any kind of barbell or Smith press is the amount of motion that the bar goes through is irrelevant insofar as what it says about the stimulus of the motion. All you really should be looking at or care about is what are essentially the joint relationships here. So what is my upper arm and shoulder blade and clavicle doing relative to my torso, and how am I loading that? Everything else is irrelevant. So don't feel like you have to touch the bar to your chest. Again, if you can't get down in that position and actually pull your arms to it, then you have no reason to be there in terms of actually loading that joint position. So wherever you can actively control to is where you should be going to. Just as a general point. And that goes for really any kind of press or pull, for example. There are some exceptions to that rule, but they're mostly related to pulling type motions. So keep that in mind. The other thing I was going to say here is fixed implement pressing. So barbell, Smith, always going to be a lot more triceps involvement naturally compared to dumbbell or cable as a general rule, just because of the physics of those motions and how they compare. But we can do things in something like a fixed press to minimize triceps recruitment. So that first set I had a little bit too narrow of a grip. Arms were flaring out a little bit. You really want the forearm to be around 90 degrees from the bar throughout the whole range of motion. So if you find that your forearm is coming out of that position, it's fine. Just recognize that if you have a sort of inward angle or really outward angle of the forearm relative to the bar, you're going to get a lot more triceps, and you'll probably feel that. So stack the forearm underneath of the bar, which means wrist over elbow, and that will be much more shoulder. And in addition to that, if you really just want to smash all the pecs and delt stuff, don't worry about locking out too much, especially because you're going to be a lot weaker there. So I was doing some locking stuff first set, but I'm going to go slightly wider, fix that grip thing, and then probably not do as much range of motion of the bar. Okay, which still means plenty of stimulus for pressing stuff So how I'm going to measure that is like, I get here, boop. And it's really one of the biggest advantages of the Smith over regular barbell is you can just fail on your own, not really have to worry about choking yourself to death. You just roll the bar forward. Chest press here, machine chest press converging, right? Converging meaning coming inward. Never used this machine before, and so I figured I'd kind of go over my process for looking at a machine, figuring out what it's good for, what it's not good for. But as always, you need to kind of start with your goals. So if I know that my goals are like middle, lower pec stuff, I know that I want some angle of force that's loading me, you know, basically back up into retraction and then slightly down, right? Not like toward the floor, but just slightly down and forward. So when I get in this machine normally, and I just kind of get in here haphazardly, these handles are way too high, right? So I want basically my forearm to be 90 degrees from the handle, which means that if I get in here and my forearm is naturally just way down here, I don't want to be all the way up here. That's not very comfortable, right? Because when I think retraction and elevation, stretching those middle lower pecs, my forearms naturally want to be here. So a good rule of thumb is find that spot that you want to be in the stretch and then adjust yourself according to the handles. So I'm going to move my seat way up, and now I'm in a much better position. And then in addition to that, you can also, on this machine, adjust handles, which is a pretty clutch thing. So you have that sort of vector to play with in terms of adjustment, seat up and down, but you can also obviously slide up and down. So what I kind of like to do is, as I'm going through my warm-ups, is just experiment with something that's very slightly different every set if it doesn't feel too good. So I like the way this feels at this angle. I also don't really like to actually fully grip the handle, because if you do, you're going to be limited on essentially where your hand can kind of slide. So it just provides a little bit more freedom of motion to not fully grip. I'm going to do my first set here. Another thing about the angles too is when you're looking at it sort of from a different viewpoint here, you can see again that 90-degree thing. And although that's not a hard and fast rule insofar as where it needs to be 100% of the rep, in any sort of pressing type of motion, I think it should definitely be that way in the stretch position. But with a machine like this that arcs from a pivot point at the bottom, there's going to be some tipping that happens, which is why I don't like to grip, right? Because if you grip, then your arm kind of has to move with the tipping instead of staying where you want it. So no grip, or at least loose grip, so my hands can kind of shift around, even though this arc wants me to move in a different way. Pec flies, setup and execution, very simple. if your arm is moving in a direction, you need to load it opposite. So because this thing only moves in this plane, you need to make sure that your arm is moving in that plane. So if I sit down, and naturally I'm a little bit sort of low, such that my arms want to rotate this way, in addition to moving back, I need to move the seat up. So this is why a lot of people are much more comfortable with an arch on pec flies, because what an arch does is it allows you to essentially load this motion by just orienting yourself this way. So basically, move in the straight line relative to where this handle is moving, and you're in a good spot. But move outside of that line, and things get fucking uncomfortable. So for me, I don't want to twist the shit out of my shoulder, so I'm gonna move these forward, and I'm gonna grip a little bit higher up, and that's much more comfortable for me. Maybe a little bit lower. See, where I want to grab is actually right where this thing is. So I'm gonna do this. And I would highly recommend bending the elbows as you come back slightly, and then squeezing the elbows in as you go through the fly. May also help any of you with some discomfort here is just a little bit of an intent to externally rotate the arm, and although that may load the elbow a little bit in a way that we don't love, the loading there is going to be really pretty insignificant. So I like a little bit of intent to keep the elbows up to the sky a little bit. That's just me. Ultimately, as long as your arm is moving in the same direction as the machine, and also as a little trick to get into this, in case you don't want the handles to be too far forward and essentially loading you without any resistance, you stand up and then you kind of slide in and press. So I did 2 presses, one for the upper half of the chest, one for the mid-lower, and then 1 fly. So that's pecs. So 8 sets total, good amount of sets. 3 on the presses, 2 on the flies. And I'm going to do triceps, 2 exercises. First one, I'm going to do 3 sets of this triceps type, diamond type push-up. And then I'm going to find a way to finagle a pull-down machine to be my triceps extension at a more neutral level. Because this gym doesn't have cables. So rather than doing like a dumbbell kickback or something, we'd rather do something that has less shoulder involvement if I can't really find a great way to restrain my arms, a great way to train triceps or biceps for that matter to some degree, depending on the exercise and the goal and whatnot, is to do something where the shoulders and the elbows are moving, right? So, something like a triceps push-up where, because the load is so far from your elbow is going to be a huge limiter instead of your shoulder. So here's how I would set it up is, find your comfortable position, hands in. I don't really like to grip the floor, so don't put your palms down like this. I kind of like to false grip the floor, and I'll show it from multiple angles, but elbows basically come way out, and I'm kind of on the bottom side of my hands. Bottom half of the range is really where the money is. So that's pretty much it. Basically just, doing it as if you were doing it with a cable, elbows flare. Much better loading on the elbows than trying to sort of squeeze yourself into a dumbbell or a barbell variant that may not feel particularly good. You know what, actually? I may actually do the dumbbell overhead extension so I can show you all how to set that up, because you can do that pretty well with a single arm, rather than trying to take a pull down machine and confuse people here. So we'll do 2 more sets of these, and then we'll do 3 sets of dumbbell overhead triceps extension. So for this last one, we're going to do like a little bit of a fancy mechanical drop. So normal set first, and then I'll show you what I do to spice it up. So just move the hands out. Try to keep the elbow flare strong. And then a little farther out. That bottom half. So to set up the overhead extension with a dumbbell, I would start out maybe 40-degree incline or so. Grab a dumbbell that you think is going to be solid, and then sit on it sideways and angle the arm parallel with the bench. So this is going to be better than skull crushers for a lot of reasons. The main one being that you actually load the elbow in a direction that it's moving in, rather than just joint jamming your shoulder. So notice I also have a restraint in my opposite hand. So come up, use the other hand against the forehead. I might have to take this hat off or just angle it. So just gonna do 2 sets here. So I did 3 plus the drop, plus all the pressing. Should be plenty of triceps volume for the day. And yeah, I'm gonna take the hat off for the set, just so it's not obstructing anything. So see you in a second. So dumbbell laterals today, because again, no cables, and anything else in terms of hogging machines to do weird shit, I just feel weirded out here as a foreigner. So feet on the front side of the bench, chest is stabilized. I like this variation just as a cue to keep my chest still. I'm going to use the lighter ones for first 2 sets, heavier ones for the second 2, and basically just slow and controlled with the lighter weights, emphasize the top or the shorter position, and then more of a bro-y type of momentum-based thing with the heavier ones. So really shove into the chest pad here and not coming all the way down, just kind of, again, doing that top half. I like a little elbow bend on these, but not very much. I'm really thinking about moving through the elbow more so than the hand. And by elbow, I really mean bottom of the humerus. So I decided I'm actually going to do a single arm crossbody Y instead of continuing with the traditional dumbbell lateral, just so I can actually load the lengthen position a little bit more, and figured it would be a good teaching moment. Whenever we want to load the bottom of a lateral raise, because you're holding a dumbbell at the bottom, it's not really doing much other than pulling your whole shoulder girdle down. So what we want to do is we actually want to load it like this. So what you can do is you can orient your body, right, using a bench at a lower incline. The reason you want to load it or use a lower incline is just because you want a slight, diagonal angle. And if you were totally flat, you would only really be able to load this kind of a plane, which would be fine. It would just be something that was slightly more rear delt as opposed to middle in terms of the ratio. But this will be plenty of middle delt, plenty of rear delt. And all you're going to do is kind of lie this way and raise in that sort of vertical portion of the arc. And what I'm doing with this other hand is I'm kind of just using it as an anchor, pulling on it to make sure I don't really get pushed forward. And I'm just really tapping out that bottom end of the range. That first set was a little bit too much of a horizontal thing still, meaning the relative angle that I want to load is kind of up in this way rather than here. So what I did was I just moved the bench up so that, oh my god, look at my fucking tan line, holy shit. So that I can kind of load a little bit more of that up to down vector while still being able to load that lengthened position really well. And you can't really see it in the video, I don't think, but my left foot in this case is really shoving me into the bench. Oh my god. So same thing, opposite side, right side now is kind of shoving me into the bench. Do one more of these. So since I won't be training calves for another, today's Saturday, so Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, like another 4 days, because I gotta travel. Travel takes a while, and then I gotta train pull and push again. I'm gonna train calves today. This gym doesn't have a calf machine, so this is a hip thrust machine. Found a box somewhere else, pulled it up. So we are solutions oriented here, not problem oriented. This actually feels really good. It's like almost better than most calf machines. So with any calf raise, but seated calf raises in particular, when you have this flat platform that doesn't arc with your foot, you want to make sure that you're mostly just moving the heel vertically and that you're not using too much toe. So I added some weight from that first set. That was kind of a warm-up-ish. I'm going to shove the ball of my toe, or right below the ball of my toe, into the platform. And when I unrack this, when I come down, I'm really just thinking about doing that kind of lower to middle half of the motion, where I'm really directly loading that ankle, right, rather than the foot. Because as soon as my foot comes parallel with the platform, there tends to be some foot clawing involvement there, which I don't love, personally. So stay kind of in the bottom to middle half, use a little bit more weight, focus on motion of the heel.